السيدات والسادة، الحضور الكريم، أرحب بحضراتكم في فعاليات اليوم الثاني من منتدى مصر للتعاون الدولي والتمويل الإنمائي في نسخته الثانية. هذا المؤتمر الذي يهدف لخلق نقاشات بناءة والخروج بتوصيات واضحة حول تعزيز العمل المناخي في قارة إفريقيا، وكذلك توفير التمويل لمشروعات التكيف والتخفيف من تداعيات التغيرات المناخية، ومناقشة تعزيز الأمن الغذائي في القارة، وتشجيع المؤتمر الدولي على تنفيذ تعهداته بشأن دعم الدول النامية والاقتصادات الناشئة لتنفيذ طموحها المناخي. وفي اليوم الثاني نستكمل مع حضراتكم ما بدأناه في الأمس من حلقات نقاشية للخروج بتوصيات فعالة. الجلسة النقاشية الثالثة تأتي تحت عنوان تخفيض تكلفة التمويل الأخضر المستدام، حيث إن تحقيق المرونة المناخية يتطلب توافر التمويل الأخضر والمستدام بتكلفة منخفضة، لا سيما للدول النامية والاقتصادات الناشئة، وتوفير أدوات التمويل المبتكرة. يقوم منتدى مصر للتعاون الدولي والتمويل الإنمائي في الجلسة النقاشية الثالثة بتسليط الضوء على أهمية خفض تكلفة التمويل لتحفيز ضخ مزيد من الاستثمارات المستدامة. نرحب في جلستنا هذه بالمتحدثين: الأستاذة شيرين شرقاوي، مساعد أول وزير المالية للشؤون الاقتصادية لجمهورية مصر العربية. السيد سيلوين هارت، المستشار الخاص للأمين العام للأمم المتحدة بشأن العمل المناخي والأمين العام المساعد لفريق العمل المناخي. السيدة الدكتورة حنان مرسي، نائب الأمين التنفيذي وكبير الاقتصاديين في لجنة الأمم المتحدة الاقتصادية لإفريقيا. السيد إثيوبس تفارا، نائب الرئيس، رئيس مكتب المخاطر والشؤون القانونية والاستدامة والشركات، مجموعة البنك الدولي، الوكالة الدولية لضمان الاستثمار ميجا. السيد جاستن ماندي، المستشار الاستراتيجي لرأس المال والعلوم والسياسات في ويلز تاورز واتسون والزميل المتميز في معهد الموارد العالمية. السيد جيك ليفن، كبير مسؤولي المناخ، مؤسسة تمويل التنمية الدولية الأمريكية. السيد يوسف بشاي، مدير أول بنك التصدير والاستيراد الإفريقي. ويدير هذه الجلسة الدكتور ستيفن هامر، مستشار الشراكات العالمية والاستراتيجية للبنك الدولي.
Good morning, panel. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We had a very exciting day one. Lots of ideas. I think the level of engagement by the panelists yesterday really showed a deep passion for addressing these issues, a real need by both governments and the private sector to work together on solutions that are equitable, that are viable operationally. And so the goal for today's panel and for all of today is to keep that momentum going and to talk about an extraordinarily pressing issue related to how to bring down the cost of borrowing for green projects. Africa has historically faced high borrowing costs. Interest rates paid by African countries on their external debt reportedly average 8% per annum. Even with similar macroeconomic fundamentals and risk profiles, African countries pay more on their bonds than countries from other regions. The so-called Africa premium is due to a range of issues. It could link to unfavorable risk perceptions, claims about arbitrary credit ratings, and a lack of liquidity in sovereign bonds. The situation has obviously gotten worse, and I think this has really been emphasized in a lot of the discussions yesterday because of the war in Ukraine and because of the ongoing COVID pandemic. Many investors fled Africa. Well, Western central banks hiked interest rates to curb inflationary pressures at home, And all of this resulted in further increases in borrowing costs for the continent. So providing Africa with affordable and stable financing, it's absolutely critical to helping governments achieve the green vision that they have for their future development. It's an urgent need to both develop and implement mechanisms that can help African countries lower their cost of borrowing and have a more sustainable debt level. So the goal for today's conversation, and I really hope we actually have a conversation, we can set the audience aside and just talk to one another about this problem. And we have an extraordinarily well-versed panel to do just that, bringing us country, regional, and global perspectives. We're first going to hear from governments about their perspective on the problem, which is challenging them on a daily basis. And then we're going to hear from solution providers from different institutions who approach the problem from different vantage points, each trying to address different facets of the problem. So let's think of these as elevator pitches, trying to get government to buy that idea to help target their particular problem. Then we'll go back to the ministers and say, what do you think? Is this viable for you? Will this address the particular challenge that you face at home, or do you think that your neighboring governments will also benefit from some of these ideas? And then finally, we'll go back to the solution providers to get some final thoughts to make sure we haven't forgotten anything about the bigger picture that we'll need to take into account to ensure that this problem is fully addressed. So let's get started now. Minister Shireen Al-Sharkawi, the first Deputy Minister for Finance for the Arab Republic of Egypt. Excellency, there was a very long conversation yesterday, very rich conversation, and frankly, extraordinarily exciting about Egypt's vision for climate investments over the coming years. Talk to us about your thoughts about how this particular challenge, the high cost of capital, is going to affect Egypt's ability to actually deliver on that vision. And then a second point, we're now less than 60 days away from the start of COP27. I'm sure your government colleagues are all too aware of that fact. How do you intend to use the platform that the COP27 presidency provides you to elevate this issue as an international dialogue, to try and attract attention by these kinds of solution providers to make some progress on that? So hopefully you can weave in some thoughts about that as well. And I will apologize in advance, but I will try and stick to some time. And so we'll ask you to keep your comments to 4 or 5 minutes. So please, Minister.
Thank you for that. And it's a pleasure to be among this distinguished panel. And thanks everybody for coming early. I hope you've all had good coffee and energized. I won't take long, but talking about our experience with the government of Egypt has started to put criteria for our investments. So in general, SDG investments are increasing. They have reached 30%, and now we are moving to 50% as well. And we've heard yesterday about Noafi and about a total of $15 billion that are needed in order to fund climate-related investments. Now, at the same time, when we want to do all these investments that are good for the climate, we have an increase in the cost of borrowing, not only for Egypt, but for other countries as a result, of course, of the situation and the war in Europe. And yields have increased maybe by a range of 4 to 6% on average. So this is significant at a time when we're trying to do fiscal consolidation, decreasing interest rates as a percentage of revenue. So we're targeting, for example, interest rates to drop from 44 or 45% to 36% by 2027. So as you see, there's a major challenge here. At the same time, from our experience, we have done a green bond for $750 million. We've done another green loan for $1.5 billion. And we've done all what is needed in order to comply with whatever is green. So this takes a lot of efforts. It required choice of projects. It required KPIs to be agreed upon. It required a green financing framework that complies with the ICMA green bond principles, second party opinion, and then allocation and impact reports. All this took a lot of time without really tangible financial reward in decreasing the cost of borrowing. So this is really the major issue that we're having. And of course, this is keeping us up at night. So how to decrease cost of borrowing? We've done various things, including diversification of different markets, tapping different investor bases and all that. But more needs to be done in this regard. And one of the things that we have also considered to de-risk is to obtain partial risk guarantees in order to decrease the risk and improve the credit profile. So this is what we've thought about, and we hope really today in this panel to come up with more ideas and to actually propagate more of these ideas, because surprisingly, some multilaterals look at exposure to guarantees just the same as exposure to as direct exposure. They treat it in the same way, and obviously it should be differently. Thank you.
So I hope the panel heard that. The minister just issued a challenge to everybody in terms of the problem that she needs to solve. And so I hope we can come back and really think about how your institutions or the ideas that you're promoting or you're implementing on the ground can actually address some of the very fundamental issues that you just cited. Dr. Morsi, in your role as chief economist at UNECA and in your career before this, did this sound familiar in terms of what governments across the continent are facing?
Yes. Working? Okay, thank you. Good morning. Absolutely. I think the issue at hand for the whole continent is that the needs are huge and growing, yet the environment and resources are getting, smaller and more challenging. So, the continent needs 345 billion US dollars annually for SDG financing. And at the same time, we're facing, the climate, all the climate risks that are rising with the continent, the most vulnerable region in the world to climate change. And we've been hit by multiple global shocks. We've been hit by the pandemic. We've been hit by the war in Ukraine and Russia. And basically all this reduced the fiscal space that is available for countries to respond to this growing financing needs. And on top of that, we are now facing a global financial markets that are actually tighter with higher interest rate, more difficult to refinance. So the finance issue of how you deal with SDG and climate change is becoming more urgent. And at the same time, you have also grants and ODA that has been actually declining. And part of it is the countries, the provider countries that are now faced with a crisis at their own home country, and that's affecting the available resources. If you add to this the fact that a lot of this concessionary financing is not available to middle-income countries like Egypt and like other middle-income countries that are actually affected, highly affected by both the climate change and by the global shocks that we've seen. So all this calls for the type of innovative solutions that can actually help address these issues. And these can be through multiple channels. So we need to see more of the blended financing to actually be able to crowd in the private sector. Sources also of reducing risk, whether through guarantees or partial risk instruments, so that actually we can enhance the environment to attract both financing and investment. We've been working on, at ECA, we've been actually working on a number of initiatives related to these issues. For example, working on debt for nature swaps, trying to actually, and we had an interesting discussion before this panel about the terminology, whether we call debt for interest swaps, conversion, refinancing. I think the key issue here is the fact that we can use these tools to actually either issue new debt that aims at addressing these green finance needs, or to refinance existing ones at better rates, incorporating these elements. We've also been working on a liquidity and sustainability facility that aims at increasing liquidity to address the issues that you've just mentioned earlier regarding the risk perception for African countries, and the fact that African countries, actually we found that they pay 100 to 260 basis points higher than countries with the same type of fundamentals. So the liquidity and sustainability facility would help deepen the liquidity for these bonds, and basically create a secondary market. And this in the long term would also help with reducing cost of borrowing. So there is definitely need to think of these kind of innovative financing solutions to address the ever increasing needs and very challenging environment. Thank you.
So one quick follow-up question. I just want to make sure that we unpack this problem a bit, because all borrowing, nature borrowing, infrastructure borrowing, are we seeing significant differences depending on what we're trying to achieve when we borrow the money? Is it, are we facing these, you mentioned 100 to 260 basis points difference. Are certain types of projects, it may be more expensive, but it's not as expensive as another kind? Can you explain, if that dynamic is going on in the continent right now?
So the kind of the Africa premium that we're referring to applies across the board. We have seen actually countries trying to, have these specialized like green bonds. Actually, Egypt is one of the countries that, few countries in Africa that worked on issuing green bonds. But the issue of the perception and the premium applies across the board. And I think part of the issue is this, shallow markets. The more we're able to deepen these markets for the African bonds and green bonds, the better we are able to reduce that risk premium. So the answer is across the board.
Thank you very much. Selwyn, you've been thinking about this issue, talking to governments, talking to international financial institutions for some time. Some ideas, talk to me about the ideas that you think are getting the greatest traction on the government side. What seems to finance ministries are thinking will work best for them, and what works best for some of the FIs out there?
Thank you so much, Steve. And first, let me thank all of you for inviting us to participate. And I really want to start by really reemphasizing what I heard yesterday on the urgency of the challenge. Right? The reality is we no longer have decades to play with to be on that 1.5 degree pathway, and we don't have decades to play with to make the necessary investments to protect people and save lives. And Africa stands on the front lines of the climate crisis. It is warming faster than the global average, and we're seeing massive impacts um, across the continent. Yet, what we're seeing at the international level really is, as many of the colleagues have um, mentioned earlier, um, great inequities in terms of how resources are directed to the continent. Only 2% of renewable and clean energy investments um, go towards Africa. This is really unacceptable. And it requires a whole of economy approach to ensure that the tools and instruments and technologies, which incidentally are readily available, um, flow to Africa and to other developing countries. So it requires institutions um, such as yours and the multilateral development banks who have a very privileged and unique role at the intersection, I believe, of public and private finance to support efforts at mobilizing the vast amounts of private finance towards the challenges of Africa, both in terms of um, clean energy and investments in um, renewable energy. It also requires developed countries and donors, and these are the very frank conversations that we've been having to improve the quality of finance being provided. Grants as a component of climate finance has steadily declined. I believe in the last OECD report on climate finance, the proportion of grants was around 25 to 26%. The grant component of development assistance and climate finance needs to increase significantly um, to help with some of the de-risking instruments. So yes, it requires governments internally to coordinate better, and we're seeing this. A perfect example is what Egypt is doing, but it also requires all of the international community to work better to deliver a better quality finance, utilize the instruments at their disposal better, and ensure that the unique and particular circumstances of Africa and other developing countries are taken into account.
Thank you very much. Um, Ethiopius, I think so, and he looked at me, but I think he was actually talking to you um, in terms of the role of institutions like the World Bank and other MDBs, but in particular, MIGA and its role in helping to de-risk investments. Over the course of the last year, a lot of the conversations I've been having internationally, MIGA's name comes up a lot, but as the conversation proceeds, there isn't a full appreciation of what type of risk we can actually provide support on. So can you talk a bit about that? Just a bit of a introduction to MIGA for those who may not be familiar, but also the specific ways in which we can help Egypt or have helped Egypt in particular to reduce the cost of borrowing.
Sure. First, let me say how pleased I am to be up here on this stage with the distinguished panel. I very much appreciate the invitation to speak a little bit about what MIGA does. So, picking up on a couple of points that have been made already, the cost of access to market-based sustainable finance needs to be lowered, right? And the current cost, is really a function of this perception of risk. MIGA provides, and for those of you who don't know, we provide guarantees to investors against sovereign risk. And I thought it'd be useful to talk about 3 steps we've taken to address this perception of risk, but also mention one step I think governments may want to consider to also address this perception of risk. So let's start with blended finance. Investors are not always prepared to pay the cost of our guarantees. And that's because the margins in development projects frequently are quite thin. But they're not prepared to go forward with these projects without our guarantees, in the absence of the guarantee. So we now have 3 funds um, that act as first loss facilities, reducing the cost of our guarantees and making possible projects that would otherwise die on the vine. We have a fund called the IDA Private Sector Window. As the name may indicate, it's IDA money that has been set aside to be blended and reduce the cost of our guarantees. And to be used in projects in IDA countries. And a perfect example of a project where we did actually use the facility to reduce the cost of our guarantee is the B-Box project, which some people here may know. It involves a mini-grid, off-grid operator in Rwanda, in Kenya, and DRC. We also have another fund recently established called the Renewable Energy Catalyst Trust Fund. Created less than a year ago, generously seeded by the Norwegian government. And here we use that fund again to blend in ways that reduce the cost of our guarantees for renewable energy projects. There's no geographic limitation here, unlike IDA, but it is specific to renewable energy projects. And then we have a third fund called the CAFF, the Conflict Affected and Fragile Economies Fund, where we do same principle applies, and we use that fund in conflict-affected countries and in fragile economies. And we've used that fund recently in CTRG gas power project in Mozambique, speaking to the issue yesterday as to whether or not we continue to support gas under the right circumstances. And here's an instance where we do. So that's blended finance. Talking about innovative structures. Because of the perception of risk, investors may be prepared to take meager risk rather than to take sovereign risk. And with this in mind, we're quite excited about a recent innovative structure we've undertaken in a project here in Egypt. We assisted the refinancing of the Scatex solar power project through the issuance of green bonds that were supported by a MEGA guarantee and an EBRD liquidity facility. And this MEGA EBRD wrap resulted in a 6-notch upgrade above the sovereign rating for the bond issuance, which in turn allowed us to actually place those bonds with institutional investors. And there are 3 things of note here that are quite sought after in development projects, but not necessarily typical. This is brownfield, one. It's a green bond issuance to refinance. And it draws in institutional investors, which has been a bit of the holy grail for us in development, trying to get asset managers into development projects. Third thing we're doing, carbon markets. And here I'm just signaling some thinking that we're undertaking. You know, natural assets of sovereigns will underpin the carbon credits that will be needed for these carbon markets. And we are trying to figure out the role we might be able to play to provide guarantees against sovereign handling of these assets in a way that actually will increase the quality of the assets and accelerate the development of these carbon credit markets. This is initial thinking, but we see there's a potential role for us to play in actually providing guarantees of the handling of those assets that actually will attract the interest of investors seeking carbon credits to manage their portfolios. And finally, something for governments to consider. And that is scalable investment programs, not too different from what you've seen with respect to NUAFI, where you design programs to support a pipeline of projects with standardized project documents, with competitive financing and assurance attached to the tender and available to all bidders, and setting a benchmark for engineering, for procurement, for construction, for operations and maintenance. And this enables competitive tendering, faster delivery, and lowers prices. And the World Bank Group has actually pioneered this approach in its Scaling Solar program and is working to apply this approach to onshore and offshore wind, with respect to mini grids, with respect to water desalination, and with respect to mass transit systems. And obviously we're prepared to work with any government that's interested in entertaining these approaches. We're actually quite keen to support governments throughout Africa who may be interested in actually taking an approach similar to what we did in Scaling Solar. You said a pitch that may have been a little longer than a pitch, but that's my pitch.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I mean, what was interesting was this sense that there are some, I'll just call them general funds, your IDA window, and then you have more targeted funds. And we'll come back to Justin in a bit after we hear from some of the other speakers, that if you've got a particular kind of project, then this may be just what you asked for. But then you also talked about fundamental system structures that if you get those right, then you can use that type of approach anywhere and just make it easier for all investors to participate. So, Jake, one thing that was very noticeable on the panel is you kept nodding at, when Ethiopius was talking about some of the ideas that MIGA's putting forward. Is this very similar to DFC's approach, or are there other variants that you all are undertaking?
Thank you. Thank you. And it's true, I was nodding in part because we've participated in some of those deals with Ethiopius and MIGA, and he stole some of my talking points. But no, in all seriousness, I really appreciated your comments, Ethiopius, in the context of the Benban Solar Park and the precedential significance of this project can't be overstated, because the way in which MIGA, EBRD, DFC came together to help really crowd in the private sector, raise credit enhancements that can allow for less expensive financing, is a game changer. It then allows the private sector to come in and reinvest to achieve longer tenors, to achieve greater distributions that can then get deployed towards more projects. And I think one of the things that we're all sort of talking about at a higher level, if you kind of zoom out a little bit, is, and I think this is exactly what the NWEFI program seeks to do and can be so successful in doing, is prioritizing more investment in sustainable and green projects. There was something somebody said yesterday in the roundtable on the energy pillar, that there's sort of been this common narrative out there that the energy crisis in Europe is a result of underinvestment in fossil resources. And he proposed an alternative frame that actually it's really about an underinvestment in renewables. And I think that spoke to this lack of prioritization. I think what NWEFI does so effectively is prioritize in very specific ways to bring all stakeholders, including the private sector, together. And so I was just resonating with Ethiopia's comments on how to mobilize the private sector, crowd it in, and reduce costs. I also wanted to pull out a thread from something that Dr. Morsi said about debt for nature swaps, because this is another area where DFC has been able to come in and bring private sector investors together with public stakeholders and reduce costs. We participated in a blue bond project in Belize, which was able to restructure $354 million of sovereign debt. And the way that we did this was through our political risk insurance tool. We insured the issuance of a new bond, which raised the bond from a double B rating to investment grade, automatically reducing costs for the financial transaction. And this is the type of model that we now see looking for a home in various other markets in Africa. I just wanted to highlight a couple other things, perhaps for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with DFC. We are the new and improved OPIC in the US government. We're the newest federal agency. We have a $60 billion authorization from the US Congress to invest in low and middle income countries all over the world. And we're particularly focused on climate. We have a net zero target by 2040, and we've committed to investing at least 1/3 of our financing in climate-linked projects. A couple of the other areas that we're interested in, which I think are relevant to this discussion. Number one, supply chains. If you talk to investors now looking at wind projects, solar projects, people are concerned about the cost of components and the way that that raises overall financing costs for projects. Last year, we committed $500 million to a 3.3 gigawatt solar manufacturing facility. We're now looking for other projects around the world, also in solar, in battery production for electric vehicles and energy storage, in supporting the supply chains for wind, towers, and turbines and components. And we believe that this is critical for building scale and reducing costs. And then I guess the last thing that I would just say, this is sort of actually not what DFC works on primarily, but because we work so closely with our partners in the US government, we see the way that this plays out in some bilateral and G2G conversations. But so often in our work to mobilize the private sector and crowd in financing from the capital markets, we run into regulatory barriers that slow things down and raise costs. And I think it's important to underscore that there are simple things that can be done to accelerate projects, to bring the speed of our transactions more in line with the urgency of this problem by allowing for better permitting structures, for easier licensing for projects, for standardized risk management tools. And I'll just sort of volunteer the services of my colleagues at the State Department, at USAID, to help provide some best practice and guidance in that regard, because I think that that can really speed things up and reduce costs as well.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Yusuf, let's jump to you. Africa Export-Import Bank. Again, similar offerings, sector-specific offerings. Where is your institution landing on this issue?
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Stephen. Good morning, distinguished panel and audience. Thank you to our hosts for having us here. Let me take a bit of a different market perspective to reframe the problem and also share with you what we are doing at Afrexim Bank to try to solve it in Africa. We believe the core of the problem today is poor market access, notably for labeled bonds in emerging markets in general. And if I can try to break it down into parts, the first part is limited supply of labeled social or green bonds out of Africa. One figure to memorize is that out of 120 billion US dollars of outstanding African sovereign bonds, the ratio of labeled bonds is less than 2%. And we actually have the debut issuers with us here on the panel. So only 2% is considered to be labeled bond issuers. Second problem is unhappy issuers due to onerous reporting, high transaction costs. Third problem is unhappy investors as well, because these bonds have not really performed so well in the secondary market. And if you look at the so-called greenium, that is the cost saving of a green or a social bond versus the conventional bond curve, it has been so negligible, maybe somewhere from 0 to 20 basis points in Africa. This is so low compared to the expectations at hand. So moving on from the problem, we are at Afrexim Bank trying to solve the problem of market access by supporting our African member states as a bond lead manager using 4 attributes. One is balance sheet commitment, especially at times of distress, like what we are having now. 2 is independent advice. 3, experienced execution. And 4 is credit enhancement. This is quite important because as a DFI, we have an investment grade rating. We are rated BBB. We've just been upgraded by Fitch last month. And this is higher than all the ratings of African sovereigns. You don't have any African sovereign today that is rated investment grade with the exception of Botswana. So we are able to leverage our credit rating, wrap bonds in order to give them some rating up notches and reduce the cost of funding. Now, let me also more practically share with you what advice we're giving to clients. And in this very volatile credit market, our advice has to be creative and responsible. So what we're telling clients today is both at the strategic and the tactical level. Strategically, we are telling clients to do proactive liability management. Africa has quite borrowed over the past 10 years. Out of the 54 African countries, we have 20 countries that have already accessed bond markets. And because of global monetary tightening, I think this is time for liability management, but with a green twist. Looking at how to not raise new debt to fund climate resilience, but to greenify your existing debt stock. I cite a nice example from Mexico, which is a large emerging market frequent issuer. Last month, they did a switch order, which is basically a tender deal whereby they swapped conventional bonds for SDG labeled bonds to investors. And that's a very interesting transaction because it was debt neutral and it managed to greenify that debt stock and meet their NDCs accordingly. Now, the investor take up of this transaction is low. So you need to do it on a systemic recurring basis. But on the strategic level, you don't need to do liability management. On the tactical level, when public markets are dislocated, you need to cave in. So look at private placements. And interestingly, we have some good examples in Africa about this. When public bond pricing is dislocated, we've seen a lot of African banks placing green private placements to investors. The size of these deals is still small, but it's very indicative and it's maybe a transient solution. So the strategic advice is liability management, and tactically, the advice is private placements to achieve more activity in the ESG bond space.
Thank you very much. Justin, you're a senior advisor with Nature Finance, and I know you've been working with many different institutions to try and launch this new sovereign debt hub that links the cost of borrowing to investments that have sustainable development outcomes. So picks up a bit on what Youssef and some others have been talking about, what Jake mentioned DFC has been focused on. Can you tell us more about that? And you know, in particular, the notion, is this primarily focused on nature? Are you going to target other forms of sustainable infrastructure? Explain where you're heading with this.
Stephen, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, lovely to be here. To start, actually, by thanking the Egyptian government for hosting us, and also Minister Shalkwe for her courtesy and hospitality in having us all here. So thank you. And it's also a great pleasure to be on a panel in such vehement agreement. How nice is that? So it's wonderful. As we all know, ladies and gentlemen, things in the outside world aren't going fantastically well at the moment. And climate change and the impacts of climate change and the impacts of nature loss are having material impacts and immediate and devastating impacts on a number of countries. And it's not going to get any better quickly. So we have a real imperative, we have a moral imperative actually to try and do things quickly to increase the likelihood of investment into projects which increase countries' resilience. Both, Stephen, to answer your question in terms of climate change and nature, and it's very easy to separate climate change and nature, but ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world which is entirely dominated by our reliance on climate and nature. So everything falls within those, underneath those headings. The idea has been that it's necessary somehow to break the cognitive dissonance between how the sovereign debt markets operate, which don't really take into account climate change and the impacts and the risks associated with that, and then to find a way that it may be possible to incentivize and reward countries which are taking measures to increase resilience to climate change and nature loss. And that purpose is to try and help define not only the risks which are material to countries, but also the key performance indicators to which countries can adhere in order to boost their policies and the implementation of those policies and the investment into private sector investments, which will increase not just fiscal headroom and investment, but also the ability for countries to withstand over the long term the sort of challenges which we'll be facing, and particularly here in Africa. Africa, which is really starting to bear the brunt of climate change with some of the world's most vulnerable people at most at risk. So the purpose of the sustainably linked sovereign debt hub, which is going to be hosted by Nature Finance in Switzerland, is to be a neutral platform whereby it may be possible to provide examples of best practice. What are the sort of KPIs which can be utilized? How indeed coherent and consistent are those KPIs across different instruments, such as those which are being used in the private sector in the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, as well as how the rating agencies are operating in this. And it is hoped that by providing this level of coherence and therefore standardization, that we can go to scale, that these sorts of KPIs can be placed inside sovereign debt new issuances, thereby bringing down the cost of capital, thereby increasing access to capital, and so generating a virtuous circle of investment, increased fiscal headroom, and increased resilience. As you say, this has been a longish journey, but we are now getting close, indeed, are able to say that the hub is in existence. We are going to be guided by an advisory board with many of those representing institutions on the panel here today, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, World Bank, EBRD, EIB, IIF, ICMA, Nature Conservancy, Nigel Topping, the high-level champion, has kindly agreed to participate, and also the Green Climate Initiative, and others will surely join. So we hope that by virtue of doing this, this will become a real mechanism to ensuring that this cognitive dissonance to believing somehow that climate change is something which happens outside the sovereign debt markets, rather than being something which has a material impact on them, and indeed can be used in a proactive and incentivizing way to increase countries' resilience to these challenges, and really importantly, to increase the amount of private sector investment into those sectors which really very badly need support. And also to, if I may, just to your remark about Belize, is also falls into the insurance sector as well. So the sort of wrapper that was done in Belize by Willis House Watson on the potential to repay debt should also be linked to these KPIs. So we provide a coherent and consistent architecture to push scalability and standardization.
Thank you very much. So I've been getting written notes as well as text telling me that we need to begin to wrap this up. So I'm gonna go back to the minister and ask reactions. So what we've had is, again, a conversation that talks about issues related to the larger global finance architecture, the lack of data. So Justin was just mentioning the need for KPIs, and so data may help on this issue, but we need systems to build that database. We've had conversations or ideas put on the table about sector-specific types of investments and more fundamental platforms that can cut across different types of investments. So again, I go back to the two questions I made it at the beginning. Do these resonate with the particular challenges that you're facing? Do you think that if you had access to or partnered with some of these institutions or ideas, that will ensure that you can go forward with that ambitious investment agenda laid out yesterday, first? And then secondly, are there some of these ideas that, as we enter the days before the Africa COP, that you think that some of these really deserve to be elevated because these speak to the particular concerns of your African colleagues? I think we need that.
Difficult question. Okay, no, thank you. It was very interesting, actually, all the discussion and all the ideas put forward. I have jotted down some of the ideas, and they all ranging from increasing grants, additional insurance creating liquidity on debt instruments. All that is great and appreciated. And already there has been a lot of initiatives. Some of them is the SDRs that have been granted, and the DSSI initiative, among others. We do still have a funding gap, and we do still have almost no differential in the cost of green. And I think um, having, of course, funds that are unified with standardized criteria, but I think additional funds need to be allocated for this purpose, given the challenge that we have at the moment. There's a part that we didn't get to talk about is also the challenge in relation to capacity building, because this is one of the challenges that are faced even when it comes to determining the needed KPIs of projects, and for the follow-up process as well. The other thing also is the ability of countries to put forward as well really good bankable projects. I would imagine this is also another important challenge. So I see it, I mean, my request or wish is actually to have more funds dedicated for that, in order to, dedicated for de-risking actually, in order to enable lower cost of funding. That's an important thing, to have possibly a more group approach rather than on separate MEGA or DFC or all that, but have more coordinated approach from multilaterals to enable that. And what I see it at the moment is that it's more, it's rather more than that, it's a negative incentive if you don't go green, because if you don't go green, you don't have access to finance, but there is no positive reward yet to allow climate and sustainable initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to let the minister have the last voice. I apologize to the panel. I'd wanted to come back for one more time. Perhaps we can all meet again in Sharm and continue this conversation, because I know that these issues are going to be coming up again at COP27. Before we go, however, I've been asked to introduce a video statement by the World Bank. This is not a plug that I'm making personally, but our managing director had hoped to be able to join us in person, but she did offer a video statement, and so I think it'll roll now.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests and partners, Your Excellency, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, Mr. Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, thank you for inviting us to the International Cooperation Forum. As host of the 27th Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC, the Egyptian leadership has taken robust steps towards making COP27 a milestone in international climate action. This year, we have a huge and unique opportunity to elevate the voices, needs, and priorities of African countries in integrating climate into their development planning. Climate change affects us all, but it does not affect us equally. Developing countries have contributed the least to rising emissions, but yet they are the hardest hit. At this critical time, Egypt's focus on implementation is both welcome and urgent. We are greatly encouraged by the new Egyptian-led country platform for the Nexus of Water, Food and Energy program. This will help move the National Climate Change Strategy 2050 from pledges to concrete climate action projects, and the World Bank Group stands ready to support these efforts. Globally, financing low-carbon resilient investments will cost trillions. The magnitude of the challenge requires us to work closely together across government, private sector, and international organizations. While there is no single bullet, let me share with you three broad principles that underpin the World Bank Group's approach to supporting countries address the climate crisis. First, it's not just about spending more, it's about spending smarter to meet both development and climate goals. We are rolling out a new diagnostic tool called the Country Climate and Development Reports, which examines each country's development and climate needs. And this will help prioritize reforms and investments so that scarce government resources can be used most effectively. Second, getting private capital flowing is critical. In some sectors, like clean energy or electric vehicles, solutions are already available and largely competitive. The private investor can speed up adoption so that scarce resources can go to R&D in less mature areas, such as improving battery storage. Finally, when private capital cannot be mobilized easily, multilateral development institutions and concessional climate finance can support investment needs. For example, adaptation investments receive only a fraction of climate finance, even as needs are growing significantly. The World Bank is committed to ensuring that 50% of our total climate finance supports adaptation. Under Egypt's leadership, we look forward to further enhancing our partnership and for fruitful discussion at this forum, which will pave the way for a successful COP27. Thank you.
Stu, Managing Director for Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank Group. Thank you very much to our panel. I enjoyed the conversation, very informative. Thank you, audience, for joining us early this morning. I hope you took away a lot of valuable information, that the elevator pitches resonated with you, and that the other panels that you'll be joining today will be equally as informative. So thank you very much.